それで全てが変わる。この惑星ベジータの運命、この俺の運命、カカロットの運命、そして貴様の運命も。
Perhaps out of all of Dragon Ball's diverse cast, Bardock, Goku's father, is its most unique character. Which is very interesting considering that design-wise and vocally, he's basically a Goku clone accessorized with evil. And even in that regard, he's not original. If you recall, we already covered The Ultimate Decisive Battle for Earth. You know, the movie that featured Tullus as its antagonist? That movie predates Bardock by a good 3 months. Still, despite his meager appearances in, well, pretty much every Dragon Ball medium, Bardock stands out. And I think that's because his original appearance, which we're covering today, stands out as a tale far more sinister and tragic than any that Dragon Ball has told before or since. Of course, nowadays he's become a bit more infamous for the various follow-ups that either go out of their way to diminish that tragedy, or just throw you for a loop by rewriting the story entirely. So I'm going to break my usual rule of following this material chronologically alongside my main Dragon Ball Dissection series of the manga, and look at the main 3 Bardock stories in succession. I think together they paint a really instructive picture at how various authors handle prequels. And I'm not covering any elements exclusive to video games like Dragon Ball Online. I don't follow any of that stuff, nor do I have any desire to. Basically, I'm not knowledgeable enough to be the guy you want talking about that stuff. Now, I talk about Bardock a lot. I was invited to discuss him on Kanzenshu the podcast, on Black and Fist channel, and on Geekdom 101's channel. When Kanzenshu put out their Dragon Ball 30th Anniversary commemorative magazine, I was asked to write about Bardock. For some reason, people like me to share my insights on Bardock. And yet, for obvious reasons, in the 5 years I've been doing Dragon Ball Dissection, I've never covered any Bardock material. Perhaps my own expectations of myself is part of what has made this script, one I figured would pour out of me very easily, so difficult to write. I've been competing against myself, what I've already said and written. Finally, rather than fight against it, I decided to actually use me to help me, because, having gone back to read my old stuff, I think it's actually pretty good. So if some of this sounds similar to the article I wrote, well, there you go. After all, if I can't plagiarize myself, who can I plagiarize? Bardock first hit the screen as the protagonist, although not the hero, of a final solitary battle, the father of Z-Warrior Son Goku who challenged Freeza, and, oh look, the first appearance of the term Zetto Senshi, or Z-Warrior. You know what? I have enough to talk about in this episode as it is, let's just not even get into that today. What's more succinctly referred to as the Bardock Special aired on October 17, 1990, just after Freeza unveils his transformation in the manga. Its story is set about 12 years prior to the beginning of the events in Dragon Ball, to the days just before Goku is sent to Earth as a baby, which is coincidentally, at the exact same moment in time Freeza decides to destroy planet Vegeta. Bardock is one of a group of lower-class Saiyans conquering planets for Freeza when he's struck by one of his victims with a technique that allows him to see visions of the future. While this means the staff can get away with using lots of clips from previous Dragon Ball episodes, as Bardock receives glimpses into his son's future life, he also becomes aware of the destruction of his own planet and Frieza's betrayal of the Saiyans. He fights back and tries to warn his fellow Saiyans, but when none of that works, he stands toe-to-toe against Frieza himself, the only line of defense for planet Vegeta, determined to change his own fate. And then Frieza blows him up with the planet. But just before he dies, Bardock realizes it's his son, Kakaroto, not him, who is destined to defeat Frieza. Or some purple-haired kid from the future. After all, Bardock can see into the future, but Toei Animation, not so much. At the time, the Bardock Special represented something completely unique to the television franchise, and it's still rather unique even over a quarter of a century later. This is not a movie like some of the other installments we've covered. Instead, it aired as a special, double-length, unnumbered episode of the TV series, in between episodes 63 and 64, or in between the fights against Gerudo and Recoome. This was the first time Dragon Ball Z or any Dragon Ball TV series would do something like this. Now, there would be 3 subsequent Dragon Ball Z television specials after this, one of which I will be covering. The other 2 are basically extended clip shows, with the only original material used to introduce the clips, and they aren't really worth talking about. But even the remaining television special is an adaptation of a Toriyama Dragon Ball story. The Bardock Special is the only one that's a completely original story, with absolutely no direct ties to Toriyama's own Dragon Ball series. That's not to say Toriyama had no involvement, just so little he admits to barely remembering doing it. While Bardock and his crew were originally designed by Toei animator Nakatsuru Katsuyoshi, those designs were then given to Toriyama, who provided his own revisions and notes, including his preference that all Saiyans have black hair. Now obviously the TV series introduced quite a bit of original material into their adaptations of the series, but this is different. All that other material, nevertheless, always fit into the serialized narrative. For example, about 4 months after this aired, episode 71 of the series devoted most of its runtime to tell a similar type of last moments of Planet Vegeta story. In fact, it used footage from this special despite contradicting it in some ways. But in that case, it was in the form of a flashback told by Freeza to the main characters. But this is a completely standalone story, a first ever Dragon Ball prequel. Since I feel that using words properly is important, I'd like to take a moment to talk about prequels. In fact, I brought this up way back in the very first episode of Dragon Ball Dissection when I warned against people referring to the pre-Z Dragon Ball material as a prequel. Because it's not. See, people have a tendency to mistake the term prequel as some kind of antonym of the word sequel. As in, if a sequel is a follow-up to a work, then a prequel is anything that comes before. As in, someone might say, I really liked The Lord of the Rings, but did anyone read its prequel, The Hobbit? The Hobbit is not a prequel to The Lord of the Rings because in order for anything to be a prequel, it has to be a sequel. Prequel simply means pre-sequel, as in, it is a sequel that chronologically takes place prior to the work it follows. Of course, now I suppose if I'm talking about the live-action movie continuity, The Hobbit really is a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, so thanks for that. I bring this up not because I'm a pedantic know-it-all, although, let's be fair, I certainly am that, but to acknowledge the very real fact that prequels bring with them the same kinds of expectations that sequels do. There's the need to up the stakes, to have bigger action sequences, dive deeper into character relations, forge new connections. But the weird thing with prequels is that it's all backwards, so they have a tendency to make those elements feel less organic than with chronological sequels. Not to mention the plot of many prequels are culled from existing backstory, which don't necessarily conform to a standard dramatic structure, at least not without a lot of tweaking or fudging of established plot details. Then there's the fact that they are written under the expectation that the audience already knows what's going to happen afterwards. Like in this special, for example, we know Bardock can't stop Freeza from destroying Planet Vegeta because we've already been told in the main story that Freeza did exactly that. A good prequel can play on those expectations, make clever reverse foreshadowing moments, and help fill in gaps fans always wondered about. However, due to that desire to connect the dots and wink at the fact that we're in the past, whether or not it's narratively expedient to do so, they tend to be a breeding ground for the most ridiculous kinds of fan service. I know they're kind of an easy target, but look at the Star Wars prequels. Tech and action sequences bigger and bolder than the previous films, the contrived tying up of dramatic loose ends that create plot holes, characters paired up together not because it makes any logical sense, but just because it's cool. My point is, and I know I'm taking a long time to get there, is that prequels are very difficult to do well because they have to progress forward while feeling like an organic step backwards. And then of course they have to be good stories all on their own and not just a glorified excuse to show exposition. Which brings us to Bardock, Goku's father. On paper, the idea of a prequel wherein Goku's near-identical father makes a doomed last stand against Freeza seems like the worst kind of fan-servicing tripe. Just forming that sentence makes me hate it on principle. Why? Because it's too coincidental, shrinks the scope of the universe, makes everyone involved too special. Even at this point in the serialization, we know that it's going to come down to a confrontation between Goku and Freeza. Oh, but it just so happens that of all the Saiyans it could be, it's Goku's father who did the exact same thing? Unless there's a very good reason to link up things like that, I feel they're better left alone. It strains credibility. But despite the odds, the Bardock special, despite what we call it, counters those potential problems by doing its best to keep Bardock from being the least bit special. And that's exactly what makes it work. The story definitely tiptoes on a tightrope between keeping to that basic tenet while still telling a story worth telling. It mostly avoids those prequel pitfalls. Bardock isn't a famous hero. He doesn't go down in history as the man who stood his ground against Freeza. He's forgotten. What he expects to be his epic showdown against Freeza is literally nothing more than Freeza flicking his finger in Bardock's general direction. When Frieza's talking to his minions about the takeover of planet Kanasa, where Bardock receives his power, Zarbon even refers to Bardock and his group as a bunch of nameless low-class Saiyan warriors. And that never changes. This isn't some kind of Rocky story of a nobody rising up and going the distance despite all odds. This is the story of a man who gives it everything he has, but ultimately fails in every conceivable way. Likewise, and I want to drive this point in as clearly as possible, this is not a story of an evil man who sees the light and works to correct the error of his ways. Again, it would have been too coincidental. Goku is one of the few good Saiyans and his father just happens to be that kind of anomaly as well. As I said in the beginning, Bardock is our protagonist, but he's no good guy. He murders people for a living. He likes murdering people for a living. He never comes to the conclusion that Freeza is wrong for having him do this. The only reason he comes to work against Freeza is because Freeza moves from killing other people to killing his people. His son has just been born, but he doesn't care, and when he does actually see the baby in person, the first thing he does is check his battle power and determine he's entirely worthless. The only reason he ultimately cares about Goku is when he realizes through his visions of the future that his son is going to inadvertently avenge him. No, Bardock is a terrible human being, and yes, according to Dragon Ball's usage, he is a human being, and I've already talked about this. But we sympathize with Bardock because Freeza is wiping out an entire group of people who did nothing but obey his every whim, whose only crime against him was becoming too good at their jobs. At the beginning of the story, Bardock and his team are praising Freeza for giving them such great planets to conquer, and that's where the pathos comes in. It's demonstrated in his wearing of his friend Toma's blood-soaked bandana. He is literally carrying the blood of his people. Sure, they may have deserved to die, but that doesn't make what Freeza does to them any more justified. And that's why the story works as well as it does. It's easy to root for a hero, a paragon of justice who does the right thing and behaves selflessly. It's a much greater feat for a story to make us care about a mass-murdering psychopath. Dragon Ball, at its core, is a story of good triumphing over evil with a generally optimistic tone. Yes, the situations can get rather dire. The action can get pretty gory. Heroes will die and emotions will flare, but at the end of the day, the characters get their happy ending. The Bardock special is nothing like that. Sure, its epilogue ends on a moment of hope, that of Son Gohan finding the baby Goku and taking him in, thereby setting the stage for the Dragon Ball we know. But at its heart, the Bardock special is something no other Dragon Ball story is. A tragedy. And not in the watered-down, colloquial way we typically use to say that something is really sad. It's a tragedy in the dramatic sense of the term, that is to say, the story of a character who is brought to ruin due to his own flaws or errors in judgment. In fact, in this story, Bardock bears no small resemblance to the tragic character of Greek mythology, Cassandra. Cassandra is the daughter of the king and queen of Troy, who was blessed by the god Apollo to be able to divine the future, but likewise cursed by him to never be believed. Of course, Bardock is cursed because he commits genocide against the Canassans. In Cassandra's case, it's because she refuses to sleep with Apollo. Cassandra predicts the Trojan War and later outs the Greeks hiding inside the Trojan horse, but the other Trojans don't believe her and are subsequently slaughtered because of that. Likewise, Bardock tries to warn his fellow Saiyans, but is laughed out of the room by them. And speaking of Greek theater, I find it interesting how the doctors, as well as Zarbon and Dodoria, function as something of a Greek chorus, discussing the various developments and explaining their implications among themselves. Bardock's tragic journey gives him the foresight to know of his planet's destruction, but to be unable to do anything about it. In fact, Bardock could have been spared. Bardock's crew is wiped out by Dodoria and a few underlings on the planet Meat. Yes, I did say planet Meat. Can't get too highbrow here. But Bardock is spared because he is healing after his I gained psychic powers by being hit on the head incident. But he follows him to planet Meat anyway, gets attacked by those same guys, and yet still manages to barely survive the assault. Bardock could just run away at this point. Everyone already thinks he's dead, and now it's been confirmed for him that his visions are true, and that Freeza is going to destroy the planet. But he's determined to change his fate and the fate of the other Saiyans, and so he walks right into his own doom. That's pretty powerful stuff. While I maintain this is a high-quality piece of Dragon Ball fiction and that it walks the prequel tightrope very effectively, there are a few moments where it does indeed stumble and threaten to fall off. On the one hand, Bardock is supposed to be a low-class warrior, a nameless, forgettable nobody. But this also came out during the Freeza arc, and Dragon Ball was known at that time for intense fighting and inflating battle power numbers, and so they mentioned that Bardock's battle power is 10,000. Geez, I'm actually complaining about battle power numbers. What is the world coming to? To give some context, Nappa's official battle power during the Saiyan arc is given as 4,000. Now, I know a lot of fans take issue with that particular number for various reasons, but a Goku powered up to just over 8,000 is enough to give him a hard time. So whatever you think the real number is, it's lower than 8,000. So just let that sink in. The low-class trash is twice as strong as an elite warrior? What kind of sense does that make? And Vegeta at the same point in time is 18,000, and he's supposed to be some kind of prodigy. And yet he's not even twice as strong as Bardock? They really should not have pinned him down to a number. It's a completely pointless throwaway line anyway. But hey, who would care about him at this point in the serialization if he had some kind of stupid Raditz level power? But that pales in comparison to the moment that really threatens to undermine any assertion that Bardock is a low-class nobody. I'm talking about the scene leading up to his death, where he literally blows through hundreds of Frieza's henchmen like they were wet noodles. I can't even fathom what they were thinking when they did that. Not only does it make Bardock into this incredible warrior, not only does it look absolutely ridiculous, it doesn't even make sense in its own context. We see Bardock struggle with a handful of these guys not 15 minutes earlier, and that was a Bardock who wasn't bleeding so profusely he could barely walk. But despite my earlier complaints about prequels often having to fudge established details to make their narrative work, sometimes I will say it can be worth it. For example, we are told in the series that baby Goku was violent and uncontrollable when Gohan first finds him. This scene does not appear to match that. At all. However, it couldn't really end on a note of uplifting hope for the future if the baby Goku starts beating up on Gohan, so I can accept that minor contradiction. And after all, we can assume that as soon as the credits roll, Goku goes into some sort of crazy temper tantrum. I do have to say that even at double length of a typical episode of the series, the story still could have used more time to breathe. The time is used very well, but everything does progress really quickly. We barely meet Bardock's comrades before they're killed off. All it takes is one short conversation for Freeza to commit to killing off the Saiyans. I hate to say it, but as much as I love the use of Dragon Ball clips as part of Bardock's visions, I think they needed to be trimmed down a bit to make room for the story. There is literally a moment when the special comes back from commercial that is just the voice of the Kanassan repeating the dialogue he told Bardock at the beginning, accompanied by flashes of Dragon Ball clips we've already seen before. The special's not that long. We don't need to be reminded of its plot halfway through, especially considering how many times the special already uses that kind of repetition for dramatic effect. But those relatively minor complaints are not enough to drag down what is a very solid 45 minutes of television. They even managed to work Vegeta in briefly without it seeming like a gratuitous cameo. In fact, the special seems to imply that it's warriors like Vegeta, super strong and super arrogant, who really cause Frieza to consider the Saiyans as a threat. And while in a lot of cases I consider that a prequel problem of shrinking the universe by having the same small group of characters influencing everything, it does make a lot of sense given their relationship in the main series. It even carries an interesting hint to the complexity of their relationship. That while a group of Vegetas would be a threat to his power, one Vegeta is useful enough for Frieza to want to purposely spare. Or maybe just subdue. I've given a lot of thought to the absence of Raditz from this special. On the one hand, it is rather odd. He seems to be the only related character left out. He's never even mentioned. It's almost as if Toei forgot entirely that Goku's supposed to have an older brother. But now that I have really weighed the positives and negatives of the situation, I think it's okay. I don't really see how Raditz could have been included in this story without it feeling contrived or just eating up screen time from a story I already think is a bit crowded. And Raditz being left to his own devices seems entirely consistent with Bardock's character and how ambivalent he is to his other son. Nozawa Masako, Goku's voice actress, returns to portray Bardock. By this point in the franchise, she was regularly voicing Goku and Gohan, and had brought the evil doppelganger Tullus to life. So I understand why some people feel her voicing Bardock as well was just getting to be too much. However, I feel it makes sense in this context. Bardock is another Goku clone, so why wouldn't Goku voice him? And before anyone jumps down my throat, because this has actually happened before, I obviously mean that from a design standpoint. In the story, we can infer Goku looks the way he does because he's Bardock's son, but in real life, Bardock looks the way he does because Goku looks like that. So he's a Goku clone. But more importantly than that, and this is just my own speculation, is that Nozawa provides an important tether back to regular Dragon Ball. This special stands alone. None of who could be considered series regulars at this point have major roles. This is a completely alien world, so having the main character still look and sound like Goku, starring the same performer who has headlined Dragon Ball in every single instance, keeps it at least somewhat in the familiar. It would be quite a few more episodes before this carried over into the regular episodes of the series, but this TV special was the first instance of music from the third DBZ movie being reused. The majority of the music is still from Movie 2, continuing its usage of that music as a theme for Freeza, but the Movie 3 music is typically used in relation to Bardock, which works due to its ethereal, haunting tone matching up with Bardock's internal struggle. But I suppose I could say more cynically that it works due to a similarity to Tullus. Aside from that, there's a fantastic insert song used during Bardock's fights, Solid State Scouter. It breaks the norm from the typically orchestral scores Dragon Ball uses, opting instead for some heavy techno-pop with an electronic voice rattling off Scouter numbers and the word Tokyo. Now, thanks to Julian from Consensu suggesting I include this in the video, I finally found out after 17 years of watching this that the song is actually a very obvious homage. Solid State Scouter is credited to the Dragon Magic Orchestra for performance and Tokyo for the lyrics. The song Technopolis by techno-pop group Yellow Magic Orchestra, found on their album Solid State Survivor, likewise opens with an electronic voice stating the word Tokyo. The similarities are very striking, and unlike the later music plagiarism scandal for Dragon Ball Kai, it's clear they were going out of their way to make sure the influence was as obvious as possible. So that might have been the end of it. The Bardock special probably would have been received as a well-done piece of story and animation from the Dragon Ball TV staff, but given its unprecedented nature, perhaps it's no surprise it led to something else rather unprecedented. Toriyama was apparently so impressed by the final result that, less than 3 months after it aired, he included a brief reference to it in his own manga, seemingly cementing its events in his own continuity. Or at least it certainly seemed that way for the next 20-some-odd years. Koyama Takao gets a lot of flack for being the guy who introduced Broly to the franchise, but he and Sumisawa Katsuyuki really hit it out of the park with this one. The Bardock special is a great example of how to tell a prequel well, and also a great example of how to tell a Dragon Ball tragedy. So of course, what does any tragedy need more than a sequel? Remember Romeo and Juliet 2, where it turns out the title characters didn't actually die, but were instead magically transported somewhere else so they could live happily ever after? Ah, what a compelling narrative. On a completely unrelated note, next time we cover Episode of Bardock.